This is National Educational Television, a program produced for the Educational Television and Radio Center.
The time is early July 1776. The place is a hall in Philadelphia. The occasion, a session of the Second Continental Congress gathered to consider the report of a committee which has been appointed to draft a very important document. There are about 50 very serious men who listen as a young Virginian reads through it. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impels them to the separation. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. There it is. The Declaration of Independence. Fine sentiments on paper. Can the challenge which they contain, can that be brought into reality? Let's forget that we know the answer and together go back over these very important, these very serious years in the story of our nation. Now, last week we saw, in brief review, the gradual steps from 1763 on down the various acts and the American answers to those acts, which led finally to the First Continental Congress. Then the First Continental Congress decided that there should be a second, and the second was set for May of 1775. Now, it was in session for about a year. And during that year, there were a great number of opinions expressed. You had a radical party anxious for an immediate break. You had a moderate party who felt that maybe the problems could be solved within the framework of the empire. Maybe there would be a redress of grievances, but little by little, things outside the Congress began to pile up. And as we said at the end of our last session, the Cold War began to get quite warm. Now, for instance, we know that before the Continental Congress met in May, in April you had the brush between the Redcoats and the Minutemen at Lexington and at Concord. There had also been the siege of Boston. One of the early things that the Second Continental Congress did was to appoint George Washington as the head of the Continental Army. But things rather tapered down. As yet, it was not open rebellion. What the colonials wanted to try to do was to prove to England that they meant business, that they were not going to take these oppressive laws sitting down. And the early skirmishes and so on were intended or were pointed in that direction as a proof of what we intend to do. We mean business. We want redress of grievances. Now, in the early part of 1776, England began to answer with a certain number of, what shall I say, a certain number of counteractions. They were able to slip out of the Patriots' trap at Boston and make off to Halifax. There, they refitted and ultimately came down to attack New York. Then, about midway through that year, there were certain brushes down in the Carolinas. There was a brush at Moores Creek, and then subsequently, there was an attempt on the part of the British to take Charleston, which was repulsed. With England acting sternly, the party within the Second Continental Congress that was plugging for independence grew in numbers, and finally we got to the scene with which we opened this discussion, the Declaration of Independence. Now, the die was cast. We were revolting. There was no question about that. We had declared ourselves an independent nation, and the question was, were we going to be able to carry through, to make good that boast? Now, before we follow this war of independence along its great lines, let's take a very quick look at the odds. For example, on the side of the British, you have, practically all, they have practically all the trumps. England is a well-established nation. She is well organized, has a functioning administration. She has an army. She has a navy. She has finances. She has a fiscal system by which she can collect more. She has world credit. These United Colonies, on the other hand, lack practically all of those things. They need, in the first place, they need something that's going to pull them together, really to make them united. So far, they're 13 sovereign, independent states. The only administration that they have outside of the state administration now, the old colonial administration, which has been revamped and become state administration, the only thing they have is the Second Continental Congress. And the men who were appointed to that Second Continental Congress were not appointed to run a nation. They were appointed initially to discuss problems that faced these 13. There was practically no navy. There was hardly an army. You could hardly say that there was an army of the United Colonies of the United States. There were colonial militia upon whom the commanders, the Congress, the Continental Congress could call, but the ability of the militiamen and the stability in service of the militiamen was something that was very definitely a question mark. Even more serious than that, we had no organized plan for finances. How were we going to finance this rebellion? And, worse still, who was going to lend us money? We probably would never be able to have enough ourselves. Where could we establish our credit rating so that bankers, even in England's enemy countries, or countries that were enemies of England, why would they trust us? Why would they give us great loans? About the only thing that was on the side of the patriots of these United Colonies was the fact that the war was being fought on their homeland, so to speak. The Americans were used to the climate. The Americans had very little, were going to have very little problem of supplies. This was going to be very serious as far as England was concerned. And another thing, too, the English were going to have quite a bit of trouble in getting their English regulars to fight against fellow Englishmen. That's one of the reasons why, in order to put troops in the field, the English had to go over to the continent and pick up such people as the Hessian mercenaries. But, weighing them out, no sane, no sound, no sensible betting man in 1776 would have been able to put a very large sum upon the colonials' chances. They did have one great advantage, however. They were fighting for a cause. And they had some rather excellent leadership and some very ingenious individuals who tried to supply and supplant certain of these basic lacks, tried to even out the odds. Now, during the rest of the latter part of 1776 and 1777, the Americans found themselves outmanned and outmaneuvered. Possibly the only reason that they were not completely beaten is due to the courage and to the ability of George Washington. But the litany, so to speak, of Brooklyn Heights, of Trenton, of Princeton, of the winter at Morristown, Brandywine, and so on, these are, as you run down them, it's a sad page in American history. There's a bright spot here and there, sure. But the American chances did not look too good. And by the time that year, 77, comes to an end, the British are in control of two of the more important American cities, New York and Philadelphia. New England is still holding out against her. However, the British have very definitely decided, and that becomes a part of their summer campaign of 1777, they want to try to isolate New England. And in order to do that, see, they're in control of New York. They're in control down here. And now they decide to move an expedition down from Canada, which will make connections with the forces in New York, isolate, and ultimately capture the whole New England area. See, they're pretty well entrenched in this middle area now. It's this campaign, headed by gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, moving down from Canada, which is, to a certain extent, something of a turning point in the war. See, his idea, or the idea of the strategy, was to move down and capture the Hudson Valley. Now, as he moves down, the German-Americans here under Herkimer inflict a blow. The folk from Vermont, Stark and his Green Mountain Boys at Bennington Heights inflict a blow. And then Gates and Schuyler ultimately close in on Burgoyne at Saratoga and force his surrender. Now, this is a feather in the American cap. But even so, basically, it is not quite enough to counterbalance the loss of New York, the loss of Philadelphia, and the various reverses. However, during these winter months, when Washington is trying desperately to hold the Americans together in their winter quarters at Valley Forge, when the desertions are taking place and so on, and the cause looks very, very bleak. In Europe, certain very important things are happening. For some time now, a great American, Benjamin Franklin, has been at the court of France, trying to interest the French in helping the Americans. Now, a number of individual Frenchmen had been so convinced. For example, the playwright Beaumarchais and a number of his friends had sent money and the like to the Americans. A number of Frenchmen had come over. But this was kind of hit and miss, a hit and miss operation. What we really needed was somebody in Europe who would back us, somebody who would furnish us with men, furnish us particularly with a navy, and furnish us with sort of, money, finances, credit. Now, Franklin was able to win the French to an alliance in 1778. The French disliked the British, and they figured, okay, here's a chance to crack back at the British for what they did to us during the French and Indian and the 7 Years' War. This is kind of a spite operation. Now, as soon as France comes in, the scene, European-wise, begins to change a little bit in our favor. For example, Spain then comes in with France. Notably, however, Spain does not come in as an ally of the United States. They had no particular love for the Yankees. But they are perfectly willing to join France in the hope of cutting England down to size. Then certain other of England's rivals on the continent are perfectly willing to lend us money to cooperate, not necessarily in the form of belligerency, but to make it difficult to create a certain nuisance value against the British. Places like Holland, Portugal, Prussia, some of the Scandinavian countries and the like, the League of Armed Neutrality. Now, on paper, 78, it looked pretty good. But on the American scene, things were not going quite as well as they might. And 78 is not a particularly happy year, nor is 79. About the only thing that lightens the hopes, brightens the hopes, let me say, in the winter of 78-79, you have the activity of George Rogers Clark and his Virginians out here in the West, where they take certain of the old French posts now held by the English, posts like Kaskaskia, posts like Vincennes, and make sufficient, carry on sufficient activity here that at a later time, when our peace negotiators sit down, they can lay something of legitimate claims to the West. But back along the seaboard, things are not going particularly well. New England, to a large extent, even though she has not been completely cut off, her effectiveness is blocked. See, one of the great English bases is up here at Halifax. The English are still in possession of New York. The English are in possession of this central area here at Philadelphia. So they figure, okay, we can more or less consider the rebellion up here in the northern half of the colonies pretty well under control. Now let's turn attention to the South. Now, in the South, they move in first on Georgia, and without too much trouble are able to hold Georgia. See, one of the reasons why they got into the South was because they felt that they would have a certain amount of support there. One thing that we must always remember is that during a good part of the Revolution, you had three different groups among the Americans. You had the Patriot group, which was by no means the majority. Maybe, let's say, roughly a third of the colonials were interested in this forceful break for independence. Then there was another portion, let's roughly say another third, who refused to go along and who remained loyal to England. Some of them fought with the English in the colonies. Some of them left the colonies, went on back to England. Others of them sought haven, sought refuge up in Canada, and formed the basis for the growing British population in Canada. These are the loyalists. Now, down in some of these southern colonies, these now southern states, you had a fair number of these individuals who were willing to string along with the English. I forgot to tell you about the third. That's a group that's more or less neutral. Many of them were the recent arrivals. They had no particular quarrel with England. They didn't see why the American colonials were raising such a ruckus. They had never had it so good. So why should they fight England? Some of them, like the Quakers too, withheld their support because of their religious beliefs. Now, but down here, England felt that she had a fair number of, whatever you want to call it, sort of a loyal underground, which would rise up if England made a move in that direction. So she takes Georgia. Then, in the next year, she moves into South Carolina. And without too much difficulty, though the Patriots hold out against her, but nevertheless, ultimately, she wins South Carolina. Then the question is, let's put the squeeze on now, move on up into North Carolina. See, here's South Carolina, and here's North Carolina. Now, her progress in North Carolina was stayed by a certain number of, they were practically speaking, guerrilla operations, people like Francis Perkins, like Sumter, like Pickens, like Morgan. They did stay the British advance, but they couldn't stop it. And so, little by little, the British column begins to converge upon Virginia. Now, here, in command of the British troops in the South, is Lord Cornwallis. And he is receiving a certain amount of support. For instance, when he gets into Virginia, he is joined by a rather sizable group of English regulars and of Tories or loyalists. The Tories, interestingly and rather unfortunately, are commanded by the man whom we know as the arch-traitor, Benedict Arnold, who had fought quite successfully, quite loyally in the early stages of the war on the Patriot side, and then for reasons that have never been clearly probed, decided to shift his allegiance and now shows up commanding a body of troops to put down the rebellion. Now, little by little, the British half maneuvered and half maneuver themselves into the Yorktown Peninsula. Commanding the Patriot troops through this section is one of the European volunteers and one of the great names, the Marquis of Lafayette. Now, gradually, they maneuver these Britishers down into this little tongue of land. Now, you might say, why did Cornwallis get himself into that type of a box? Well, the answer is this. The British Navy and some more supporters were supposed to move down and to reinforce him here. However, at this particular point, when he is hard-pressed, word comes to Washington and to Rochambeau, who has a considerable number of French regulars, and to the French Admiral de Grasse. They pick up intelligence of the British plan, and Rochambeau and Washington move down here from the head of Chesapeake Bay to reinforce Lafayette. De Grasse sails up to prevent the reinforcement of Cornwallis and his group. They stand off the British squadron, and the Americans and the French combine and force Lafayette into this untenable position, and in October of 1781, he surrenders. Now, Yorktown, as far as the Americans are concerned, more or less closes hostilities. It's perfectly true that the British are still in possession of New York, and they will withdraw from there slowly. During a good part of the next year, the British fleet and the French fleet are, with the Spaniards cooperating, are sparring with one another down in the Caribbean. But as far as the military operation of the Revolution is concerned, that has come to an end with Yorktown. And in this year, in this next year of 1782, the Americans send their delegates to Paris to talk over terms of peace. Now, these terms of peace, the discussions go on almost endlessly. France does not show herself a particularly generous ally at this time. France is very interested at this particular point in getting as much out of the Americans as she can. And while she doesn't directly double-cross them, nevertheless, she is not particularly loyal. Now, England Well, before we go on to that, she's being needled by Spain. Spain is terribly afraid that if the Americans are given too much territory, the Americans are going to end up right next door to the Spanish territory over here in the Trans-Mississippi. So they try to block large-scale concessions to the Americans, particularly try to block giving the Trans-Allegheny West to the Americans, which the British were more or less willing enough to do, at least sections of it. Finally, the English are quite disgusted with the delaying tactics of the French and the Spaniards, and they arrange a preliminary treaty with the American delegates, and that preliminary treaty in early 1783 becomes the basis for the Treaty of Paris of that year. Now, this Treaty of Paris of that year recognizes the successful fight which the colonies had carried on and recognizes the independence of the United States. So at this point, we can say now there is a USA, and the series is coming to, not its end, but coming close thereto. Now, as you are well aware, the literature on the Revolution is voluminous. There's a good deal of material, the memoirs and the writings and so on of the men who took part. And various angles have been studied. Let me suggest 4 of the late books, the late studies. In 1948, John C. Miller writes his Triumph of Freedom. It's the same author whose book we recalled to you last week, The Origins of the Revolution. It's a very interesting general study. Then, in 50, Willard Wallace writes The Appeal to Arms, and in that he stresses military history. I'm sorry I can't show it to you. I guess that probably someone of my students is working on a class assignment and has it out. But at any rate, Wallace is another modern study. Also along, or emphasizing the military side primarily, is this 2-volume work, first volume is here, of Christopher Ward, The War of the Revolution. Very excellently done. Then the last, or the most recent of the books, and one of the most delightful of all treatments, is The American Revolution by John Richard Alden. Now, this man wrote the book himself, no connection with Miles Standish or the like. So here we are. We've now got a USA. Little by little, the story has crystallized, and there is the first of a series of new nations in the Western Hemisphere, the United States of North America. It's a great story, and I'm sure that, at least I hope, let me put it that way, I hope that you've been stimulated to go beyond the few notes that we've been able to give you and to read more deeply. It'll well repay the time that you spent. Thank you.
The preceding program was produced for the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.